Welcome, everyone, to The Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old, historian, surfer, and world traveler. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting some of the latest scholarly research in the social sciences and in the field of surf studies. So paddle out with us while we glide through the world of academia. Joining me today from Florida is my friend and colleague, Professor Charlie Harris. Charlie's a doctoral candidate in history at the University of South Florida, studying the United States military during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. His dissertation examines the changing place of the U.S. Navy in American popular culture during an age of massive overseas expansion at the turn of the 20th century. For today's episode, we'll be discussing his research on Dewey mania, the Spanish-American War, and consumer culture. But Charlie, before we get going, I'd like to personally thank you and our listeners for being part of this episode of The Surfing Historian.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate the time today and been looking forward to this for a while now, actually. So yeah, my dissertation started off with really questions brought up here in the USF History Department about, the first expansion overseas for the United States. Because at the time, westward expansion being finished, the United States still was kind of, the people were still trepidatious about having a standing army to start with. So I really started to begin to discover or try to figure out why the United States, why the people would start to kind of drift towards this really supporting overseas empire as it was. So really the way I have started my research was looking at a group of naval admirals and policy advisors they're called the Navalists nowadays. Very strange word, still shows up as an incorrect word whenever I write it. But these were policy influencers. These were guys who were right there with the imperialists in Congress, who really did believe that the United States needed a bigger footprint on the world stage. And the way that they could do that was to increase the size of the Navy. So in the 1880s, my dissertation, is called Surest Guarantee of Peace, which actually comes from a Theodore Roosevelt quote when he became president, when he was discussing the Navy and what its main focus was. Of course, TR, always being the salesman, pitched it as a guarantee of safety. But this is the time when you really were estimating the success of your country and where you were societally by the size of your Navy, the size of your military. And at the time, these were the super weapons of the time. Steel steam battleships were being produced by England, Germany at the time. And the United States was just getting their feet wet in 1883 with the first contracts going to private companies. So this Navy grew and grew. And really, it was a complex group of factors that helped this, because when I think just from reading the news nowadays, I think an aircraft carrier these days costs about $13 billion and takes 13 years to make. So back then, they didn't know how to do any of that. This was all new for them. So politics was very, very integral in American naval power slowing down, speeding up through the 1880s and 1890s. But it really started kind of coming to a head throughout the 1890s with a crisis in Chile, and as well a crisis in Venezuela. And I don't want to get into the particulars of those ones, but the long and short, these navalists that were helping to decide American foreign policy saw that the U.S. Navy was ill-equipped to even deal with Chile or Venezuela, forget Germany. So that's really how that started. And really also during this time period was the time where print journalism really kind of took a hold in the United States. There had always been newspapers since about 1750s, but this was when industrial level printing first started factories that could produce hundreds, thousands, millions of copies eventually. So going on at the same time as this revolution in print as well is the Cuban Revolution. Spanish people, or the Spanish Empire, basically portrayed in the United States as not taking care of their colonial wards, and really the brutality of the Spanish Empire on their people, not just in Cuba, but in their other colonial possessions, became front and center of yellow journalism during the 1880s and during the 1890s. So after Cuban revolutionary leader Jose Marti comes to Ybor City and gives a speech during an international tour. I think the tour is about a year long, where he was looking for international help. So you know what? A lot of historians kind of say that the Spanish-American War did not start because of yellow journalism, but certainly the conversation of what is America's responsibility to lift up groups of people who are not as civilized as we are. What is our responsibility as a nation to help these people who are being persecuted? So really, we embrace the freedom fighters during this time period. The relations between the United States and Cuba, between Spain, are very tenuous at this time. From 1897, it's really about they've gotten to a point where the Navy is now mobilized to the Pacific in order to respond to the Spanish Navy in the Philippines. And the USS Maine has been dispatched to Havana Harbor just as a peacekeeper. Well, on February 15th, 1898, most likely from a boiler explosion, the USS Maine ignited in Havana Bay, killing over 700 men. It became a battle cry. Immediately, the newspapers blamed Spain. The president blamed Spain. And the famous phrase was, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. And it really kind of ignited this anti-Spanish fervor in the United States. But make no mistake, although even Teddy Roosevelt challenged McKinley's manhood over not going to war with Spain immediately, it was in his best interest, in his more jingoistic version of American foreign policy, that McKinley declared war on Spain. So really at this time too, all the Navy planners, the president, as well as the naval planners in Spain all knew that America's new steam Navy was far more advanced than the Spanish, and that this was not going to be a victory for Spain. Everyone knew it. But when the Spanish-American War actually begins on May 1st, 1898, it is a total surprise to the press, who was really thinking that this was a tenuous situation. They even had press members. John Barrett was a member of the press, who was one of the very first war correspondents after the Civil War. But he called it a miracle, a glorious victory, and it really was that. The particulars of the battle itself, really, it was a total devastating loss for the Spanish. They lost 6 ships of the 10 that they launched, and America suffered no losses. It was a case where even the fact is, it's pretty simple. Steel versus wood. It's just not going to be good for the person with the wooden ship. So again, when this is reported back to the United States as a miracle, and the result of it is that the leader of the battle, the head naval commander of the forces in Manila Bay in the Philippines, a man named George Dewey, he would become the hero of the hour. He would become known as one of the most magnificent military leaders of all time. And really, he's pitched in the press exactly that way. John Barrett, who I previously mentioned before, was actually a politician and an ambassador, gave it up to become a war correspondent and report on this war. And there was a lot of that. The people who wrote the history of the Spanish-American War at first were journalists and politicians, which tells you a lot about what we know about the history of the Spanish-American War. But Dewey himself became a celebrity, one of the very first celebrities that we know of in America. I mean, Buffalo Bill was popular. Thomas Jefferson and Washington were celebrities in their own right, but this was a living celebrity. The LeBron James and Lady Gaga all mixed together into one. This is what if you see little boys in the little sailor outfits, that idea comes from the Dewey suits. That comes from this time period where mothers and fathers were remaking their little boys as the great hero. So he really was the embodiment at the time of American manhood. I don't have a picture right here of him handy, but he's this. If you see the picture, you may recognize it. He's got this broom mustache. He's always at this specific, very manly angle. Always dressed to the nines. As a matter of fact, that his famous white uniform is very reminiscent of this chivalric, intelligent, decisive, stern, humorous at times, but always under control. His masculinity was always measured. And really a lot of that is true, but the man who Dewey was before the Spanish-American War was not the man that Dewey was after the Spanish-American War. So really this popularity, one of the things that my dissertation really kind of tries to get around is, why does the Navy become popular in the 1880s and 1890s? It does become popular. And I kind of put that question together with, why did the American citizens believe that American overseas empire was a good idea? Because America got behind the Spanish-American War and its results. Historians are split over whether yellow journalism had anything to do with it. But my firm belief is, just from the research I've done, is from what people read and what people bought, it shows what their loyalties are, what brands that you buy, the stuff that you consume. And I think that that's more true now more than ever. Really shows your identity and what you believe. And at this time, when Dewey becomes a celebrity, he becomes the subject of dozens and dozens of history books. His biography is written by no less than 10 authors, and the Spanish-American War, as well as books about the colonial possessions of the United States, become widely published. Every time I think I've found all the books, I find 5 more that were printed during this time period.
You say that Dewey embodies, or was the embodiment of American manhood, and I think you explained that certainly in how you sort of articulated what he looks like in most of his these images, and so. But I want to actually, in terms of some of your research, you actually use a term that I had never heard of personally, and you use this term military Darwinism. And would you mind sort of elaborating on what that term actually means? Is that something you've come up with yourself, or were there, where did you conceive of that term?
Well, it's kind of funny, when we write these histories, and I can only imagine what, authors like a Kristen Hoganson or a Michael Sherry or somebody who's been at this for decades and decades and has so many publications on when they come up with these terms and how they figure out whether someone's used it before. Google searches are great too for that. But military Darwinism for me really is an extension of social Darwinism, where you're taking Charles Darwin's pretty much brand new definitions of evolution, and you're applying that really without his direction. You're applying that to human beings, and really the survival of the fittest, where Darwin kind of gets coined with this term. He did not coin that term. That is the press, and really social Darwinism itself kind of puts European or really American style white civilization on a plateau above non-white. And you can kind of go down the list of who is termed as non-white and who isn't, who's white, who isn't. And some of that has to do with sometimes not even skin color as much as it is societal evolution, where your society has reached a level of achievement. Are you in your first industrial revolution? Are you in your second industrial revolution? How big is your navy? And so to a certain extent, military Darwinism is, however, the survival of the fittest, who's got the biggest guns, who's got the biggest ships and the most of them.
It's sort of self-explanatory in a way, obviously framing it around the idea of social Darwinism and applying it to militarism. So I sort of had a hunch as to where you were going with that. And so, yeah, I think that's a good term to, I guess even a frame or lens to view, what is happening with the United States in, particularly in 1898, as they move out in a really significant way onto the world stage. And so, in your research, you also say that many Americans began to accept imperialism as a social norm in the late 19th century. And so, and particularly of the gendered nature of this process. And so I know that, you've mentioned, when you were talking a little bit earlier, you mentioned jingoist or jingoism. And, obviously you've talked about the ultra masculinity, or the framing of Dewey as the ultra masculine. And so are you saying that, many Americans at this time, because I know that, when we say, well, the U.S. is an empire, like in 2021, if you were to say that, people would many would look unfavorably upon, you making those remarks. But are you saying that, say at the turn of the century, 1898, moving into the 1900s, are you saying that amongst many Americans, the concept of imperialism was welcomed, or was that a select few? What was it, the majority of opinion, or what? In other words, was it welcomed? Was it something that was seen as positive?
You know what? And that's really the crux of my entire project, is discovering this public opinion, which is not easy to find. I was told by a couple of naval historians, including a gentleman, Dr. Brandon Little, who's on my dissertation committee, basically, good luck finding public opinion. I mean, nowadays it's, one click away on a smartphone, but back in the 1890s, you really weren't getting written public opinion. Matter of fact, the letters to the editors of the newspapers were from guys like, Roosevelt. Not necessarily the common citizen was writing in newspapers at the time. So the only way that I could go on public opinion, in my opinion, was what books were read, what newspapers were purchased, items that were purchased that had either war themes or Navy themes. And that's really kind of where I discovered all the Dewey and Spanish-American War paraphernalia. And really, when it comes to masculinity and notions of masculinity, I think that what we're talking about here is the paternalism of empire. Why did people accept empire? Well, because, quite frankly, the word empire at the time, imperialism, didn't have the same negative connotations as it does today. I think, you think empire today, you're thinking Lord Vader, right? You're thinking the worst of the worst. Back then, to a certain extent, imperialism was a humanitarian effort. It was going into, and that's another thing that really kind of helped to develop, really, I think, the modern sense of American exceptionalism that I think's been maybe a little perverted today. Back then, they looked at it as, well, we're not taking over, we're not doing colonies like the Spanish. We're going in and we're going to help these people bring their level of civilization up so that they can self-rule. Of course, the only people who were determining whether they were capable of self-ruling was the United States. And to a certain extent, there's a paternalistic relationship there with us as father, and say the Philippines or the Cubans as our children. And so that's an aspect of the larger process that's gendered, I think. But even more specifically, the idea of America being that prim and proper man who will bite his lip and take until he can take no more, and only hitting back after provoked, never firing first. That kind of exceptionalism, honor, chivalry was very important, and the Dewey image kind of exuded that.
And thank you for, sort of elaborating on the, in terms of how folks viewed popular culture, I guess I should say, viewed the notion of imperialism at the turn of the century. And obviously not everybody was on board, but it seemed like popular culture was sympathetic to it in terms of their, at least what they were buying. Like you said, you spend a lot of time combing through a lot of Dewey paraphernalia, as you said. And so, in terms of the United States coming on the world stage in and around this time, it's many historians suggest that 1898, which is when, you mentioned the Spanish-American War. And I guess for the listener, we should clarify that we call this the Spanish-American War. However, the Cuban War of Independence against Spain actually kicks off in 1895 with the individual you mentioned earlier, Jose Marti and Maceo, and a number of other individuals that would be part of that, initial, coming after the 10 Years' War, but the what we would refer to as the Cuban War of Independence. So the U.S. gets involved in 1898, as you said. And the impetus, I guess, in a way, some would argue was at least it was used as an excuse, the explosion of the Maine. And so, but that brings me back to my question. Many historians suggest that in 1898, this did mark a watershed moment in that the U.S. took a more formal imperialistic posture globally. What does that mean? And would you say you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And, Jason, you and I have been having discussions about American empire for, 4 or 5 years now, And I think my opinion of it has changed over time because of really understanding the different forms of it. But at this time, hard empire, military interventional empire, which is the classic, what we've been talking about, really, for the United States in 1898, you got to keep in mind what else is going on at the same time is this is the peak for the scramble for Africa. So to a certain extent, the Philippines particularly, and Cuba, it becomes that they don't want those particular places to fall under the hands of the Germans or the Dutch who are expanding. And actually, there were German naval vessels outside of Manila for weeks after the Battle of Manila Bay. So even at the time, Dewey was very trepidatious about the Germans. So to a certain extent, it's also an expression of the Monroe Doctrine, which of course, is an American foreign policy that basically says that no European nation can interfere in Latin America. Well, I don't know when the Philippines became a part of Latin America, but it almost seems like that the United States kind of extended that Monroe Doctrine, and really, empire is what you make of it. And American imperial aspirations had everything to do with opening up world markets because they had reached the West Coast and literally ran out of markets. I mean, the shift towards a large maritime force also comes with a caveat, which is these warships, which are important for projecting power, are equally as important for your merchant marine fleet. And I think that's as much of a symbol to me of imperialism than a warship or Dewey and his mustache is a fleet of 10 cargo ships waiting to dock in Manila. To me, that is a form of empire, no doubt about it.
So I want to bring you back to Dewey himself. And so, you mentioned something in your research that says, his name ranks in many respects among with those of Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Lincoln, Grant, Farragut, and others who have had such an influence upon the history of this expanding republic. And of course, by expanding republic, you're talking about the United States, of course. But how does Dewey rank, alongside individuals like that?
Well, it's a very interesting quote. It comes from John Barrett, who I referred to earlier, who wrote back to and this is what he wrote in his book about it. He wrote many articles directly out from the deck of the Olympia, but this was a quote in his book that really kind of shows that it was either one of two things. It was either they really thought that he was as influential on his history as George Washington. And for Navy people, Admiral Farragut has its own connotation too. He is the Civil War hero of the Civil War Navy. And so it's either that this guy really believes that Dewey is this, or that they're already starting to kind of project this hero. And I submit that it's probably a little bit of both, because one of the words I have not mentioned today that's very important when it comes to Dewey, the Spanish-American War, the press, all of it, is the word spectacle. They wanted to make this into something that would draw the headlines. And sensationalism, calling this glorious, calling Dewey, putting him up there with the founding fathers, okay, who at the time, there was no New Left reassociation of the founding fathers at this time. They were gods on earth, and to be put into there is quite interesting, considering the fact that less than 2 years later, Dewey will be completely out of the public eye.
Something that you just mentioned as far as, Farragut, for example, and you said, he was an admiral in the Navy during the Civil War. And so I've never really given any thought to a naval presence during the Civil War. And so how did that work? And so in other words, what role did Admiral Farragut play in the Civil War to be of such significance and to be elevated amongst the other, founding fathers like Washington and Jefferson and others? So what role did he play that was so significant?
Well, during the Civil War, the South really didn't have a Navy to speak of. You had the United States Navy, okay? They say Union Navy, but to a certain extent, that still kind of throws me, because they didn't rename the ships or anything. But basically what the Navy's operation was during the Civil War was to blockade every southern port town to try to prevent them from, doing everything. Trade, especially trade to Latin America for cattle, was a big thing back then, as well as getting cattle from Florida up to the northern states. You could do it. They did it mostly over land, but ships were important. So during the Civil War, the American Navy put through a plan called Operation Anaconda, and it really, if you think of the map of the South itself, and basically their Anaconda was a snake that went all the way from the Mississippi River down the Mississippi all the way up past Virginia, and so during this time period, the Navy was really credited with a lot of especially they would not have been able to succeed if these ports weren't blockaded. And considering the fact that for the first 2 years of the Civil War, the South was winning, is kind of preposterous. But even to a certain extent, like how amazing the Navy was at the time. First off, this is the first steamship that was produced. Both sides produced the steamship around the same time that fought each other to a draw. So that was kind of an innovation that eventually leads to my studies. But even an episode where they flooded part of the Mississippi River to get to Vicksburg. They literally changed the river to get a ship close to Vicksburg. I mean, talk about environmental destruction on an epic level, flooding thousands of acres to get a ship through. So the Civil War, Farragut was a very important figure. When you think of Grant, Farragut really was at the time as elevated.
Wow. Yeah. And I think, I would imagine a number of our listeners, and I'm putting myself in there as a listener as you're talking, that could be new to many of us. And, so especially just the role that the Navy and ships played in the Civil War. And, as you said, with cattle and beef, when Sherman effectively went through the South and cut off access to the West, Texas, Florida became increasingly more important in terms of cattle and effectively food. And so, that's really, I guess, pun intended, food for thought. And so I do want to I keep bringing you back to Dewey, because I do find it, really intriguing how he rose to fame and then fell off so quickly. So I want to actually ask you a bit more about your specific research and your, you called it Dewey paraphernalia. And so what was one of your favorite Dewey items that you found, and that's sort of a personal question. And then it could be the same answer, but what was one of the most interesting Dewey items you found?
So really my favorite piece was a couple of clocks that they had at the Independent Seaport Artifact Collection in Philadelphia. And basically it was two basic clocks that you would see on a mantle or something, probably approximately, 18 to 20 inches tall, and, maybe about 12 inches wide. And you could buy one of the Dewey clocks from Sears or any one of the mail order catalog companies for about $35, which wasn't cheap back then. You could buy a roll top desk for this amount of money. And think of where a clock like this would be displayed. It would be displayed on a desk, or it would be displayed on a mantle, someplace in the house of prominence that says what you believe in, what you stand for. You're not going to have this clock in your house if you are against the actions of America in the Spanish-American War. And so this clock would have been presented by somebody with a lot of money. Well, right next to this clock in the archive is a Dewey clock that someone made with their own found materials. It's made with a spice rack that's about the same size. They used a homemade clock that does not work at all, with brass hands, and they used a piece of cardboard with shelf paper on the back to build it up, but on the front was paper mache'd on a newspaper article with Spanish-American War and Dewey on it. So here you have someone of a lower socioeconomic class producing their own Dewey clock to put in their house. I think it says a lot about the range of people who found these things that they wanted to put them in their house.
You say that Dewey sort of fell off, in terms of his popularity. And my question is well, what happened? And I guess there's a follow up to that, in that I understand that we had the U.S. had the Spanish-American War, and then there was the Philippine-American War, and it really seems like a lot of individuals, and I think Mark Twain would be of this group, where people were very much sympathetic to U.S. imperialism and U.S. involvement, let's say, in the Spanish-American War. But as more and more atrocities came to light in the Philippine-American War, particularly, human rights violations and things like that, people were much less sympathetic to, the cause, if you will, of imperialism. And so does that coincide with Dewey sort of waning in popularity?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I think it's tied completely to it, because he actually, when he gets back from the United States, he has 3 parades that are done for him in Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C., millions of people at each. The Navy actually gives him a break to go and celebrate, and he tours the nation on the back of trains, on ships as well. So for a solid year, he is celebrity. He is the America's hero admiral. He had at least 40 parades in his name that year. So keep in mind that papers are trying their best to keep his name in the papers as much. Dewey had a parade in Saskatchewan. Dewey had a parade in Montpelier. Any place where Dewey was that was the headline. Meanwhile, the other headlines below the flap on the newspaper were talking about what you were just saying, Jason, which was the war wasn't going that well. They were saying that it was going well, but there were officers coming back from the conflict reporting these atrocities. And really, to a certain extent, anti-imperialism began to really kind of fester. And so the proof that Dewey's fame kind of flames out is, A, you don't see anything really produced with his image on it past 1900. But he also has a failed presidential run in 1900 where he actually courted taking on the Democratic nomination to oppose President McKinley. He pulls out, you would think, well, he pulls out because McKinley or Roosevelt must have come and talked to him. No, he pulls out because the Democrats don't think he can win it. They just don't think that his celebrity is its stature, is the way that it used to be. And again, I think that the fact that the headlines from the Philippines are getting worse and worse shows you. And I tell you, and if we could hit this caveat real quick, come back to consumerism just a little bit. During this time, from 1897 to 1902, Parker Brothers that does the games that you know well, Monopoly, Risk, Life, they started making board games for kids based on these world events. The first one being the war in Cuba. So while the parents are reading headlines of the war in Cuba and holding up the Cuban revolutionaries as the freedom fighters from the past, their kids are they're learning about what the binary relationship between colonial power and subject, asked to pick sides. And I guarantee you, everyone fought over being the Cubans. I guarantee you. But then after the war starts, Parker Brothers shifts focus and they produce 4 different naval games about the Spanish-American War, some to do with Dewey's victory in Manila, some to do with Cuba, the victory in Cuba. But then in 1902, and this kind of shows that maybe the marketers were a little behind the 8 ball as far as the popularity of Dewey, like they hadn't figured out by 1902 that it wasn't popular. They released another board game called US-Philippine War, Crushing the Rebellion in Luzon. And really in this game, you're supposed to be defending your American bases in the Philippines from the Philippine insurrectionists. So keep in mind, you got in 5 years, you are going from a board game that's supposed to help the freedom fighters in Cuba. 5 years later, you're now trying to defend your colonial territory against insurrectionists. And really, this kind of speaks to this time period where really the utopian idea of lifting these countries up has turned into something else, and something that isn't popular with the United States. And I think that does contribute to his downfall, but not really a downfall, because he actually uses this popularity not to his advantage, but others use his popularity to their advantage. And they developed something called the U.S. General Board in 1900. So as soon as Dewey fails as a presidential candidate, he's assigned to this board that basically, as soon as Theodore Roosevelt takes over as president the following year, they become the de facto naval secretary. And really, Roosevelt hires 4 different naval secretaries over 8 years, litigious sycophants, every single one of them with no naval experience. And so he's decided that he's going to trust his naval decisions from a board that includes Dewey, that includes a couple of guys who are this old school but new school navalist. And really the best way to describe them is as progressives. This is the beginning of the progressive movement in the United States, at least one of them. And one of the reform focuses of the progressive era was the U.S. Navy.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because, obviously we talk about this a lot and, more importantly, it ties into your research, but the notion of consumerism, you provide a good case in point to show that shift as well. On the one hand, in the case of the Spanish-American War, you have a Parker Brothers board game encouraging, like you said, the kids would, argue over who would be the revolutionary, the freedom fighter. And so you have a board game in that case encouraging the people to sympathize with the cause of revolution against colonial Spain, Whereas only a few years later, you have board games doing quite the opposite, actually. And that I mean encouraging the players to sympathize with the cause of occupation and denounce, if you will, or fight against the freedom fighters who are fighting to free themselves from this new occupier, which is no longer colonial Spain, but rather the United States. And so, yeah, I think you provide a really good case in point, and I'm glad you brought that up. And so with that, I actually want to go ahead and give you the last word.
Well, hey, thank you, Jason, so much for this opportunity. This is my first podcast ever. I think this is a great experience. We get stuck in these writing projects, and again, I'm a 50-year-old student. I'm 200 and some odd pages into a dissertation. Some of it I don't even recognize as my own writing, and I think one of the things that a lot of historians can lose is this back and forth that we have right here. And so I really appreciate the platform and the friendship, man. I really do appreciate us working together. Dr. Irwin, who is both my major professor and yours, has really, I think, done an amazing job of us not even putting us together. I think you and I kind of found each other as far as what we study, and I've learned a lot from you, especially considering that, man, I wasn't even thinking about Latin American interventions or anything when I started this. And, here I am discussing, I think the subject I am getting ready to research right now and talk about is the 1902-1903 Venezuela crisis. And I did something I didn't know as a naval historian. I'm a Dewey historian, Great White Fleet historian, but I had no idea we sent a 50-ship force to Venezuela in 1904. What? So again, I think that learning about, the fact that my project has gone all the way from shipbuilding and higher education, that now I'm in Latin America and learning about conflict in a way that, again, I guess I'm always going to be a student, man. I guess that's the conclusion I have come to. I will be a student forever. But I really hope that my project kind of brings to light a little bit that I don't want to excuse the attitudes of the past. I think there's a lot of that goes around today about, excusing someone's words from 200 years or 100 years ago because that was the social norm. But I think it's important to recognize what the human mind and the American mind is really, how influential, how easily manipulated that we are, as well as how fickle we can be when it comes to almost any subject. And if you were to tell me tomorrow that, well, President Biden's invading Chile because, well, you know what? That's what we got to do. There wasn't anybody in America that would vote for that now. No one actually. Overt hard imperialism is something that is abhorrent. And it's been that way for quite some time now. I'd even have to say maybe Vietnam was kind of the last, time that we did it, that it was like more than just nation building, and it was ideological. And it's getting to the point now where I think that we almost have returned to a progressive era in a way, because now we require some type of an incident or some type of society in crisis for us to respond with our military. And really, I think that if we just look at the past and see how it's happened back then, that we can certainly try to learn from that nowadays. I'm not a project ahead kind of historian, but as you have found in your work, if you're doing your job, it's going to happen. So, but man, thank you again for this.
If you enjoyed this episode with Professor Harris and I'd like to invite you to check out my next episode, where I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Leon Mock. Dr. Mock is an associate professor of environmental policy and socioeconomic values at the Center for Tropical Island Biodiversity Studies in Bocas del Toro, Panama. In this upcoming episode, we'll be discussing his recently published article that he co-authored with Dr. Jess Ponting, titled Establishing a Pre-COVID-19 Baseline for Surf Tourism, Trip Expenditures, and attitudes, behaviors, and willingness to pay for sustainability. You won't want to miss this informative episode. This has been another episode of The Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old. Be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. Again, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay stoked.